This was no ordinary war. It wasn't just a sword fight, and not just the desire for a throne. That was that era, when the cross is not just a symbol of faith. Rather, it had also become a weapon of power. The thrones of Europe were shaking. France and England were thirsty for each other's blood, and the land of Spain. Such a war was awaited, whose decision is not made on the field. Rather, it was to be in the dark rooms of fate. Person, heir of royal blood, the most powerful boss, but the uncrowned king, John of Gaunt. He made the cross a flag. The army was sent across the sea and started such a campaign, in which more than the enemy, time, hunger, and disease proved to be killers. This is the story, such a crusade, which has no great battle, but the end turned the tide of history. This is that war, the one who fought, but it was never fully fought. The Crusade of John of Gaunt was a major event in European political and military history in the late 14th century. John of Gaunt was the most powerful nobleman in England and was known as the Duke of Lancaster. His campaign was ostensibly religious and crusading, but in reality it was driven by political power and royal succession. John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, March 6, 1340 to February 3, 1399, was an English prince, military leader, and statesman. He was the fourth son, third surviving, of King Edward III and the father of King Henry IV. He was one of the richest men of his time and an influential figure during the reigns of both his father and his nephew, Richard II. As Duke of Lancaster, he is the founder of the Royal House of Lancaster, whose members succeeded to the throne after his death. His birthplace is Ghent in Flanders. John's early career was spent fighting in the 100 Years' War, fought in France and Spain. He unsuccessfully attempted to enforce a claim to the crown of Castile through his second wife, Constance of Castile, and for a time called himself King of Castile. Reasons for John of Gaunt's campaign. The main reason for John of Gaunt's campaign was his claim to the throne of Castile. John of Gaunt's wife, Constance of Castile, was the daughter of the former King of Castile, Pedro the Cruel. After Pedro's assassination, the Trastamara family had seized the throne by force. John of Gaunt, declaring himself the protector of the legitimate heir, took the position that the throne of Castile was in his wife's favor, and on this basis he launched a military campaign. The campaign was originally a family and inheritance war, which was later given a political and religious color. A major reason was the long-standing rivalry between England and France. At the time, France was strongly supporting the Trastamara dynasty, as Castile was a close ally of France. John of Gaunt knew that if he captured Castile, not only would France's influence be reduced, but England would also gain a powerful naval ally. Thus, the campaign became an indirect war against France, which was considered very important in the context of the 100 Years' War. Political power and personal prestige were also major reasons for this campaign. John of Gaunt was the most powerful nobleman in England, but he never became king himself. By gaining the crown of Castile, he wanted to join the most powerful rulers in Europe. Through this campaign, he wanted to strengthen his political position, increase his importance in the royal family, and be remembered in history as a victorious ruler. The religious coloration was a means of gaining public support for the campaign. Although the war was not strictly a crusade, it was presented as a war against pro-French rulers and in defense of the interests of the church. The purpose of this religious image was to gain the support of the people, the nobility, and the church in order to facilitate military recruitment and financial resources. In this way, a political war was given a moral justification. Economic interests were also at play in this campaign. Castile was a strong naval power, and its coastal areas were of great commercial importance. John of Gaunt believed that if Castile came under his influence, English trade would be secured, sea routes would be strengthened, and French economic interests would be severely damaged. Therefore, this campaign was not just fought for the throne but also for economic supremacy. The campaign was also linked to the internal politics of England. King Richard II was young, and John of Gaunt was practically the most powerful man in the kingdom. Through the external campaign, he wanted to avoid internal criticism and to link his leadership to a positive national cause. The war thus also served as a means of reducing political pressure at home. Campaign preparations. In 1386, John of Gaunt began his campaign by establishing political legitimacy. First, he solidified his claim to the throne of Castile on legal and moral grounds. He demonstrated his wife, Constance of Castile, by highlighting her lineage as the legitimate heiress of Castile. To this end, diplomatic letters, proclamations, and attempts at alliances were made in European courts to present the campaign not as a personal campaign, but as a recovery of legal rights. Troops were assembled from all over England for military preparations. John of Gaunt used his personal estates and royal influence to recruit knights, infantry, archers, and experienced captains. Since this was a long and overseas campaign, discipline and experience were not the only factors to consider. The army was made clear that this was not a campaign for mere plunder, but for a formal victory and the conquest of the throne. The management of financial resources was one of the most difficult preparations for the campaign. John of Gaunt financed his expenses from his personal wealth, the income from his estates, and borrowing from the royal treasury. Indirect support was also obtained from Parliament, although full financial support was not forthcoming. Nevertheless, the campaign was linked to the national interest, and taxes and contributions were collected to pay for the army's salaries, weapons, food, and ships. Naval preparations were given special attention because the route of the expedition was by sea. Ships were built on the coasts of England, old ships were repaired, and new ships were chartered. Since both France and Castile were naval powers, the risk of naval clashes along the way was taken into account. Experienced sailors and naval commanders were recruited for this purpose. Diplomatic alliances with Portugal were an important part of the campaign's preparation. John of Gaunt had made an agreement with the Portuguese king to launch a joint campaign against Castile. This alliance not only provided military support but also provided access to the local geography, logistics, and safe bases. This was why the campaign began in Portugal, from where entry into Castile was considered relatively easy. A great effort was also made to gain religious and moral support. Although it was not a formal crusade, it was presented as a struggle against an illegitimate ruler to gain the tacit support of the church. Through church sermons and statements, the soldiers were made to feel that they were not just part of a war but a struggle for truth, which was an attempt to keep their morale high. Finally, the leadership and command structure was clearly established. Officers were appointed to each division, with separate responsibilities for logistics, military discipline, and battle strategy. John of Gaunt was presenting himself as a general, not just a pretender, which was evidence that the campaign was being undertaken with serious planning. The role of the Crusaders in this war. Although John of Gaunt's campaign was not officially called a crusade, it was marked by crusading thought and crusading elements. In this era, being a crusade did not only mean going to Jerusalem, but also participating in a war with the permission or tacit support of the church that could be given moral or religious justification. John of Gaunt presented his campaign as a righteous struggle against illegitimate rulers and pro-French forces, which attracted the support of crusading-minded knights and soldiers. A large number of English knights and soldiers joined the Crusades under the guise of a crusader. For many knights in the Middle Ages, war was not only a political duty but also a spiritual one. They were convinced that they were fighting for a righteous cause, and their participation was associated with honor, reward, and salvation. This was why many experienced warriors accepted the campaign as a sacred duty. The role of the Church was indirect but crucial. Although the papal edict did not issue a formal crusade, the Church did not openly oppose the campaign. This tacit support was an indication that the ecclesiastical circles were not happy with the rulers of Castile, an ally of France. Church sermons and religious narratives used words such as justice, legitimate right, and struggle against oppression, which bore a strong resemblance to the ideology of the Crusades. Military preparations and travel conditions. Preparing for war was not just about gathering weapons, but also about mobilizing an entire nation. John of Gaunt gathered troops from various parts of England for his campaign. They included knights, longbowmen, infantry, and support staff. Providing each soldier with weapons, armor, food, and wages was a major problem. This army was not being prepared for a short raiding party but for a long and decisive campaign, so the planning was extraordinarily complex. The greatest test before the voyage was the naval arrangements. Taking an army across the sea was not without its dangers. There was a shortage of ships, the uncertainty of the weather, and the constant fear of French or Castilian naval attacks. Many ships were chartered, some acquired from the royal fleet, and some old ships were repaired. For the soldiers, sea travel was a strange and terrifying experience, where disease, hunger, and storms could be fatal at any moment. When the army set sail from England, morale was high but the outcome uncertain. As they moved away from the coast, the soldiers realized that they had embarked on a journey from which they were not certain of returning. For many, it was their first time traveling so far from their homeland. The cramped conditions on the ships, poor food, and lack of water made the journey even more difficult. Some soldiers fell ill along the way, while others lost their lives. After reaching Portugal, the difficulties increased rather than subsided. Although Portugal was an ally, local resources were limited. The army was large in numbers and supplies were scarce. Fodder for the horses, food for the soldiers, and repairs to weapons became a constant problem. The heat, the different language, and the unfamiliar terrain slowed the army down. At this stage, for the first time, it became clear that the plan, while strong on paper, was proving to be as weak in reality. The advance into Castile became a test of patience. The long distances, poor roads, and the enemy's avoidance of direct combat exhausted the army. The Castilian forces had adopted a strategy of cutting off supplies and wasting time rather than engaging in open battle. As a result, John of Gaunt's army was weakened without a fight. Hunger, disease, and despair did more damage than the sword. These conditions of the journey tested the morale of both the leadership and the army. On the one hand, John of Gaunt tried to keep his army united. On the other hand, he also felt that his position was weakening with each passing day. These were the moments where the campaign began to turn from a triumphant march into a struggle for survival. Clashes during the campaign. There was never a single decisive main battle in John of Gaunt's campaign. This is the most important and striking fact of the campaign. Although the aim of the campaign was to seize the throne of Castile, the enemy forces deliberately avoided a major battle in the open field. Therefore, the campaign is remembered in history not as a great battle, but as a long, tiring, and indecisive military advance. The campaign consisted of small but continuous skirmishes rather than major decisive battles, which gradually depleted the army. When John of Gaunt's army entered Castile through Portugal, the enemy avoided a major battle in the open field. The Castilian forces knew that direct confrontation could be dangerous for them, so they adopted a strategy of raiding and defense. The first clashes took place in the border areas of northern Castile, where local militias and Castilian troops attempted to slow the advance of the English army. These clashes took place mostly around castles, in narrow passes, and in rural areas. Although the English army was technically superior, they were unable to gain a clear advantage because they were fighting on enemy territory. The greatest damage was caused by skirmishes along the supply routes. Castilian cavalry raided at night, burning food convoys and then disappearing. These attacks had a profound effect on the morale of the army, as the soldiers fought from hunger and fear without seeing the enemy. In several places, English troops pursued these attacks, but the local geography and the speed of the enemy thwarted them. Some skirmishes took place near fortified towns, but even there a decisive battle could not be fought. John of Gaunt had neither the time nor the resources to sustain a long siege. But no city was completely conquered. As the army advanced into the interior, disease and exhaustion became the real enemies, rather than fighting. The long march, lack of food, and constant pressure weakened the army. Although there was little contact with the enemy at this stage, each passing day had become an undeclared war for the army. The overall picture was that the campaign was more a battle of strategy and endurance than of swords. John of Gaunt's army won several small skirmishes, but failed to achieve a decisive victory. The Castilian forces used time as a weapon, and this weapon ultimately proved to be in their favor. In the end, it was more of a strategic failure than a battlefield defeat. Without a major battle, the campaign slowly died down. The army retreated, swords still sharp, but morale broken. Thus, the war went down in history as a campaign fought, but never fully fought. Thus, the campaign ended more as a strategic retreat than a military defeat. John of Gaunt did not lose on the battlefield, but he did not achieve the goal for which he set out. He did not gain the crown, but he gained influence through royal connections. History remembers him as a leader whose battles were decided not on the battlefield but at the negotiating table. In short, this war was not lost in a single battle. This war was lost without being fought. Negotiations and their final outcome. Finally, in 1387, negotiations began with a recognition of military weakness and the realities on the ground. As John of Gaunt's army suffered from constant skirmishes, disease, lack of supplies, and exhaustion, it became clear that a decisive victory on the battlefield was no longer possible. The army was capable of advancing, but not of winning. This was the moment when reason began to replace the sword, and informal diplomatic contacts quietly began to move. The first contacts were established through Portugal, which were both an ally and a potential mediator in the campaign. The Portuguese court knew that the war, if prolonged, could be detrimental to the entire region. Therefore, the Portuguese royal circles began to convey messages between representatives of Castile and John of Gaunt. These negotiations were initially secret and cautious, so as not to damage the self-esteem of either party. John of Gaunt turned to negotiations in earnest as his army grew increasingly disillusioned. The soldiers were ready for battle, but the odds were against them. Treasury was running low, allied aid was limited, and the enemy was playing for time. In these circumstances, John of Gaunt realized that if he continued to be stubborn, the campaign could turn into a complete disaster. The most important point during the negotiations was the claim to the throne of Castile. The Castilian side made it clear that it would not give up the crown directly under any circumstances, but that an honorable way back could be provided. This was the point where politics defeated war. The discussion moved in the direction of achieving what could not be achieved by the sword, through relationships and agreements. Eventually, a historic compromise was reached, under which John of Gaunt renounced his direct claim to the throne of Castile. In exchange, his daughter was married to the Crown Prince of Castile, later King Henry III. Thus, John of Gaunt did not receive the crown, but his blood was infused into the royal veins of Castile, a great achievement in medieval politics. With this treaty, the war effectively ended. The army withdrew, swords were sheathed, and the battlefield fell silent. It was a war that ended without victory, but not without complete defeat either. John of Gaunt lost the war, but won the politics. Thus, the ultimate outcome of this campaign proved that the most powerful weapon in the Middle Ages was not always the sword. Sometimes a marriage, a signature, and even a treaty could decide empires. For the rest of his life, John of Gaunt served as a valued advisor to the king and a loyal supporter of the crown. John of Gaunt died of natural causes at Leicester Castle on February 3, 1399.